I did want to introduce one other person that's a visitor today, or accompany me to make sure I'm not making a mistake. And that's Delora Roop, because you haven't met Delora, my wife, of almost 54 years. Well, last week we dealt with chapters 1 and 2, Genesis 1 and 2. And as I said that time, compared to its neighbors, Israel was really pretty reticent or didn't get involved with talking about creation so much. And even when they did, they weren't interested in how it happened or when it happened, like we are. They were interested in what it has to do with everyday life, who we are, and what we're supposed to be doing, what we've been made to do. And so we read that two different ways in which that they gave voice to that. In terms of the more poetic voice was, they talked about the fact that we were empowered to take charge. An amazing thing, because they lived in a world in which people were supposed to do what the God directed. And they were empowered to do it. And in the more narrative story, they talked about the fact that they were given incredible freedom to make decisions. And they were given what it takes to have a full life, including soil and other people, community. And I said that oftentimes, or in the oral stage of when this was passed on in the villages around the well, villages were built around the well because water was the most precious thing there was. And so if the well went dry, everybody had to move. I mean, town was done. Village was done. So, but around the well, that's where you gathered, and that's where the kids played. And the grandparents sat, and they would tell the stories. And I can just imagine at the end of this poetic story and this more narrative story, some kid making a mistake and saying, but that's not the way world is. Community. And so it's a rancher versus farmer story. Okay, that's a book. There are 7 books for that one too. And then the other one was that God already knew Cain's Cain's character. And so God made a choice on the basis of Cain's character. Well, there are several books on that one too. But the fact is we don't know. And that's exactly how there are things that happen and you don't know why. You don't know. And they make you angry. See, this isn't a story about way back when, and a story completely about a world we don't live in. And it makes you angry. Makes me angry. Maybe you don't get angry. I get angry sometimes. Less often than I used to, but it still happens. But none of those are any more right than the other. Because we don't know. That's the character of Hebrew narrative. But it's also the character of life. There's a lot that happens and we don't know. And it seems unfair. And it makes us angry.
And he went and killed his brother.
Ah. Why? Doesn't tell us that either, does it?
I didn't hear what she said.
Why does he went and killed his brother? And the answer and the question is why?
Jealousy seems the simplest, but that's too simple.
Well, what happens to make you want to destroy the person or thing, however that destruction takes place, of the one who seems to be the cause of your problem? When does your anger get so intense that the only thing you can think of is, maybe not physically, but some way, getting them back or getting rid of them?
It would seem to me to be a survival instinct.
Pardon?
It would seem to me to be a survival instinct that if someone else is getting the favor of the Lord or the parent, maybe then your share of the food or whatever is going to be diminished.
It's unfair and it enrages. This isn't a story that we don't know. When they thought about what went wrong, they thought about everyday life.
The thing that caught my attention last week, and kind of segued into this week, is that God had told Adam and Eve, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you will die. And then, in fact, they do eat, and they don't immediately die.
They don't.
So then the question is God a liar? Was he being intentionally deceitful, implying that you would assume they thought they would immediately die? Or was there a more convoluted explanation that prior to eating from that fruit, they were in fact immortal, and eating of the tree caused them to become mortal?
Well, this is all interesting discussion that has occurred to lots of people. It's enabled folk to cut down a lot of trees and write a lot of books and stay employed. We'll see. These are all, there's a kind of pattern of, we tell stories in a pattern too. I mean, if you watch TV, if it's a police story, you know the pattern it's going to take. And you know that about 10 minutes before the end, there's going to be some crisis that gets resolved. And if you watch Hallmark, it's the same thing. There it's about 20 minutes, because that's an hour show. 20 minutes before the end, there's some crisis that's going to get resolved. Okay.
Well, Gene.
So these are told, yeah, go ahead.
I have another question on, is this one of those instances in which we often do of looking back? And so the Hebrew people have the story of the sacrifice later on, and then the Christians have the story of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and they say, well, we have to have a reason for this. And so they read back into that story of Cain and Abel. Oh, this sets the tone for the redemption of the world via, first of all.
Yeah. Well, we know that the most we know is that the story was reused, but it was reused slightly in a different way. It was used as the tradition built on and the stories continued to get retold. It was used, and it comes into the New Testament, especially in the time kind of between the two testaments. The story was retold, and it became the story of an evil person and a good person. And but here you don't get that sense. I was going to say now, these are always, I want to respond a little more to Paul. These are set up as transgression and consequence narratives, okay? They're going to be all set up the same way. There's a transgression, and there's a consequence, okay? Life's kind of like that, you know. And the consequences are always unexpected. And the surprising thing, Paul, in these consequences is they're never as dire as they could be. And that's a real surprise. And one, because in the narratives, at least in this set, God's in charge of the consequence. It's never as dire as it could be. And that's true of Cain. It's true of Adam and Eve, and it will be true of some of the subsequent ones that we read too. Why? I mean, what's going on there? Well, it doesn't tell you, but it does. You do notice the consequences never as dire as one would expect. Cain is not executed. In fact, God protects him. What in the world is going on here? And Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, don't die. Their life is forever changed, but they don't die. There's no sense. There's no indication that they were originally immortal, and in fact, that would make this very much closer to a Canaanite or a Akkadian story than a Hebrew story. But it's not nearly as dire as you would expect, because they go on and have children. And Cain, incidentally, if you remember what Maria read, came with the help of the Lord. So it's not likely that God sent Cain as a help to give Cain as somebody that was a bad character. And that's not probably what the way they think about people. We get angry. Heck, almost everybody, maybe in your story, she doesn't get angry, but yeah, we get angry. And one of the things that we want to do sometimes is get even. Or, if we're really angry, get rid of the problem. Okay, those are those two stories. We got started a little early, so that's good. We can get to the donuts earlier. All right. Now we have two more stories.
Genesis 4:19 through 26. Lamech married two women, the first named Ada and the other Zillah. Lamech said to his wives Ada and Zillah, "Listen to me, wives of Lamech. Pay attention to my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is paid back 7 times, then Lamech 77 times." Adam made love with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him." Seth also had a son and named him Enosh. At that time, people began to worship using the Lord's name. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. As the earth's population began to grow, daughters were born to the people. The sons of God saw that these women were beautiful, and they took the ones they chose and married them. God said, "My breath will not remain in humans forever, since they are flesh. Each will be allotted 120 years. The Nephilim lived in earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the divine beings went into the women and had children by them. These were ancient heroes, famous men."
Weird story. Okay, there's two more stories. Sorry. Two more stories. What'd you hear?
Genesis 6, 5 through 8. The Lord saw that humanity had become thoroughly evil. Indeed, every impulse of the human heart was evil over and over again. The Lord came to regret ever making humanity on earth. The pain reached to the very center of God's heart. The Lord said, "I will rid the earth of the human beings I have created, people together with the animals, the crawling things, and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." But the Lord felt good about Noah.
Okay, so we got three. We added the next story, the introduction to the flood narrative. But think a little bit about the story of the kind of song that Lamech sings. What did you hear Lamech say? The same song that he sang. What did you hear? Or maybe you didn't. That's all right. Listen to me, wives of Lamech. Pay attention to my words. I killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is paid back 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. All of a sudden, violence has become a way of life. Now that's unusual. Now you're not only going to pay back even, you're going to escalate the violence. That's never happened in our world. Do you see what's happening? The stories they're telling about what went wrong. So they tell these stories and pass them on. No, you're right. My grandchildren, we're not living in a world of Genesis 1 and 2. We're living in a world that is very difficult. And then you have this weird story. And if you want to read a story that nobody understands, you just heard it. But let me tell you about the most that we understand about it. Israel was really concerned about mixing the divine world and the human world, which was very much a part, if you know ancient mythology, even in the Greek and Roman mythology, a mixture between human world and the divine world happens. And Israel was deeply concerned about that. And so you have this really weird story that we don't know where it came from. I doubt if any list is Genesis discussed 100 times and they'll skip this one. Because we don't understand it. All we know is, all we can say about it is, this must be a story about God's concern, not to let there be two kinds of beings running around, half human and half divine and fully human. Now, it tells a story. It may be what we call let's see, how do I can use the word that won't make any sense to most of you, etiology, but it's how do you explain the existence of something? And the Nephilim were giants. I mean, they were big people. And so at one time it may have been a story to explain the existence of people that are 6'10" in a world of 5'10" or something. We don't know. But the function of it here is to say how deeply distorted the world really that we're living in, how deeply distorted it can be. And we've experienced that. We've experienced that. And then, now, I know a whole bunch of language that gets associated with these texts have no grounding in the text itself. One is language of the fall, one is language of original sin. And in fact, the word sin isn't even used, except in the poem in Genesis 6. There's this kind of funny experience of transgression, that we have the freedom to make harmful choices. And there are unforeseen, unexpected, and mostly unwanted consequences for those choices. It's a simple story about real life. Simple stories about real life. And they're not esoteric. They don't necessarily even build on each other. They're just stories of life. But they're stories that, the first story is about the kind of fracture between the closest relationships in community we have, those we've committed ourselves to. And then there's a story about the fracture between siblings. And from that, the fractures, then there's this kind of development that seems to engulf us, violence. And then there's these kind of other distortions that we don't even understand in life that split things up. Now there's two stories of God's response, or two different discussions of God's response. I just had Marie read the first one. What did you hear there? What is God's response? Regret what?
Regret creating humankind. regretting creating humankind.
There's this kind of deep sense of regret. The Lord saw that humanity had become thoroughly evil, thoroughly distorted. Indeed, every impulse of the human heart, by the way, heart in Hebrew is not this locus of feeling. That's in the intestine and the stomach. Do you ever feel in your stomach?
Feel in your gut.
The heart is that integrates the mind and the stomach feelings and is the impulse of action. So when you read Hebrew heart, don't think about that on a stick. It's that center of your being out of which your impulses to action arise. Of this track to the very deepest center of God's being. And God ends up in tears. Some of us have had those tears, probably sitting here together, when perhaps a family disintegrated and it struck to the very deepest center of who you are. Or something else. They say, the narrative that the grandparents said, that the Lord came to regret ever making humanity on the earth. It was that tearful. Now in the next section, God's angry rather than tearful, but we're used to thinking maybe about God might possibly be angry. This one, God is crying. I'm sorry that I made it. Okay. So we've got God going along with this in this story, and it ends up in tears. Does that make any sense? We don't think about God that way. But in Hebraic thought, whether it was, and actually this carries over into the New Testament, probably farther than I thought. People who are New Testament scholars tell me it's more than I think it is. That, when we try to translate or tell the story of faith in a new culture, in words and language that culture can understand. And I'm talking now about when it went from the Hebraic culture into the Greco-Roman world. Greek philosophers had different ways of thinking about God. And one thing they thought about was God has to be the first cause. Because they began, there's a good reason the Hebrew language doesn't create philosophers. Greek language does. But, and the other thing was that God has to be omni-everything. But for the Hebrews, they wouldn't disagree with that particularly. But the importance of God is God's relational presence. Not whether God's bigger than everything else. But God is deeply involved with the creation that God established. And so when people do this, it to the very core of God's being. And so God decides what? I'm going to try again. We think, oh, come on, God doesn't change. Well, if you've created people with freedom, you better adjust to the decisions they make. Maturity is the ability to adjust. God happens to be fairly mature usually. And so God adjusts. Remember, God tried this business about community using the animals, and it didn't work. So God created a gender which enabled community in a way that animals didn't. Well, God decides, and we're the part of a faith that we say, God made another decision later to send God's very own Son to see if that would make a difference. Well, this is God's decision to wipe this thing out and start over. See if I can't do it better this time or something. I don't know. It doesn't say what God thought about that, just I'm starting over. And so you get this long flood narrative, except God finds one family that seems to be closer maybe to what God intended us to be, and decides, well, I'll start over with this family. Remember I said, Paul, the thing isn't ever quite as dire as it could have been. So God decides, okay, there's one family, I'm going to hang on to all the animals, even the bad ones, and one family, and I'll start over. And the next section, we're going to look at the start over. And what we're going to find is a very interesting thing, I think, at least what I see. The people don't change, God does. So we're going to look at that a little bit. So for the rest of the time, we'll look at that and not worry too much. We're not going to run as late as we did the last time. So we're going to stop now. The donut should be fresher than last week. And we'll